The cruelest betrayals rarely begin with strangers. They begin with someone who already has a key to your front door. My name is Margaret Sullivan, and until that Thursday afternoon I believed my greatest blessing was the family gathered around my dining room every Thanksgiving. I was 70 years old, recently retired after 38 years as a public school librarian in Columbus, Ohio. My husband, Thomas, had passed away 3 years earlier after a long illness, leaving me with our beautiful 2-story brick home, countless memories, and enough savings to live comfortably without burdening anyone. My only son, David, had encouraged me to stay in the house because, as he often said, "Dad built this place with love, and it belongs with you." I believed him. I also believed his wife, Jennifer, when she smiled warmly every Sunday and insisted that we were one happy family. Over the past year, Jennifer had gradually become more involved in my daily life. She offered to help organize my bills, schedule home repairs, and even suggested updating some legal paperwork after Thomas passed away. She always sounded thoughtful and practical. Whenever I thanked her, she would laugh and say family should look after one another. Looking back, I now realize that trust is often surrendered one small decision at a time. That Thursday, I had spent the morning volunteering at the local community library before meeting an old friend for lunch. We talked for nearly 2 hours about retirement, grandchildren, and all the ordinary things that make life feel peaceful. As I drove home beneath a clear autumn sky, I was already thinking about making a pot of soup for dinner. Nothing about the day suggested that my entire world was about to change. When I turned onto my street, I immediately noticed David's pickup truck parked in my driveway. That was unusual because he was normally at work until early evening. Jennifer's sport utility vehicle sat beside it. I smiled, assuming they had decided to surprise me with an unexpected visit. Carrying my purse and a small grocery bag, I walked toward the front porch. The first surprise came when my key refused to turn. I tried again more carefully, convinced I had simply missed the lock. Still nothing. Confused, I examined the doorknob and realized it had been replaced with a completely different lock. Before I could even knock, the front door slowly opened from inside. Jennifer stepped onto the porch without smiling. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest, and her expression was colder than I had ever seen. "Margaret," she said evenly, "you cannot come inside anymore." I laughed nervously, certain she was joking. "Very funny. Now let me in before the soup gets cold." She did not move. Instead, she reached into her pocket and held up a small ring of unfamiliar keys. "These are the new locks. David and I agreed this is what is best for everyone." My smile disappeared. I looked past her shoulder, searching for my son. He appeared slowly in the hallway behind her, refusing to meet my eyes. In that moment, standing on the porch of the home my husband and I had built together 42 years earlier, I realized something far more frightening than a locked door had just happened. My own family had decided that I no longer belonged inside my own home. For several long seconds I could not find the words to answer either of them. I stood on the front porch staring at my own front door as though it belonged to someone else. The grocery bag slowly slipped from my hand, and a carton of fresh strawberries rolled across the porch before stopping against the welcome mat that I had bought years earlier. Jennifer glanced down briefly but made no effort to help. David finally stepped closer, his shoulders tense and his eyes fixed somewhere beyond mine. "Mom," he said quietly, "please do not make this harder than it has to be." I looked directly at him, hoping to see the son I had raised instead of the stranger standing inside my hallway. "Harder for whom?" I asked. "Because from where I am standing, I cannot even get into my own house." He rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit he had carried since childhood. "We have talked about this for months." I shook my head slowly. "No, Jennifer talked. You listened." "I never agreed to anything that involved being locked out of my home." Jennifer took one step forward, until she was standing fully in the doorway. "Margaret, this house needs structure now. You have been forgetting things lately. You leave lights on. You misplace mail. David and I believe it is safer if we manage the property." Her words struck me harder than I expected because they sounded rehearsed. "I forgot to turn off a porch light once," I replied calmly. "And I misplaced one electric bill that I found an hour later. That hardly means I cannot live in my own home." David sighed deeply. "Mom, please understand. We are trying to protect you." "Then why did you change the locks while I was volunteering at the library?" Neither of them answered. The silence itself became an answer. I looked past them into the familiar living room where my husband's favorite chair still sat beside the fireplace. Family photographs lined the mantel exactly where I had placed them after Thomas passed away. Everything inside belonged to the life we had built together, yet I was standing outside like an unexpected visitor. "I just need my medication and a few clothes," I said quietly. Jennifer immediately replied, "We already packed a suitcase for you." She pointed toward the porch where I had not even noticed a small wheeled suitcase resting beside a potted plant. My heart sank. They had planned every detail before I arrived home. David finally looked at me. "There is a nice extended stay hotel about 15 minutes away. I booked a room for 2 weeks. We will figure everything out after everyone has time to calm down." I stared at him in disbelief. "You reserved a hotel room before telling me I no longer had a home." His face filled with guilt, but he still did not step outside. Instead, Jennifer reached into her purse and handed me an envelope. "Your temporary living expenses are covered," she said. "Everything is explained inside." I accepted the envelope without opening it. It felt strangely heavy. As I looked down, I noticed several folded legal papers tucked inside beneath a prepaid hotel reservation. Before I could ask another question, Jennifer quietly closed the front door. I heard the new deadbolt lock into place from the inside. Standing alone on my own porch with a suitcase I had never packed and an envelope I had never expected to receive, I unfolded the first legal document and immediately recognized the signature of an attorney I had never hired. My hands trembled as I unfolded the legal papers, expecting to find some misunderstanding that could easily be explained. Instead, the first page carried the letterhead of a respected law firm in Columbus and the signature of an attorney whose name meant nothing to me. Across the top were the words "temporary occupancy agreement," followed by language claiming that David and Jennifer had assumed responsibility for managing the property because they believed it was in my best interest. I read every sentence twice, unable to understand how anyone could prepare documents about my own home without my knowledge. There was no court order. There was no judge's signature. There was nothing stating that I had surrendered ownership. Only carefully written language suggesting that I should voluntarily remain elsewhere while family matters were resolved. I slowly placed the papers back into the envelope and looked once more at the front door. The curtains moved slightly, and for a brief moment I caught David watching me from the living room before he quickly stepped away. My heart broke a little more because I realized he knew exactly what was happening. I picked up the suitcase they had packed for me and walked back to my car. The drive to the hotel felt far longer than 15 minutes. Every traffic light gave me another opportunity to wonder how an ordinary Thursday had turned into the most painful day of my life. When I arrived, the receptionist greeted me warmly and handed me an envelope that had already been left in my name. Inside was the room key and a handwritten note from Jennifer that simply read, "This will give everyone time to adjust." I folded the note without responding. I was not interested in adjusting to losing my home. After placing the suitcase beside the bed, I carefully examined everything inside. Most of the clothing had been chosen by Jennifer, not by me. Several favorite sweaters were missing. My wedding photograph with Thomas was gone. The small wooden jewelry box that always sat on my bedroom dresser was nowhere to be found. It became painfully clear that someone else had decided which parts of my life were worth keeping. Sitting quietly beside the hotel window, I called David. The call went directly to voicemail. I left only one message. "Son, whatever has happened, I am asking you to meet me tomorrow morning. Just you and me. No arguments. No lawyers. No Jennifer. I only want the truth." He never called back that evening. Instead, just before sunset, my telephone rang with an unfamiliar number. The woman on the other end introduced herself as attorney Susan Harper. My heart immediately recognized the name from the legal papers. Before I could ask a single question, she spoke gently. "Mrs. Sullivan, I understand today has been extremely difficult. I represent your son and daughter-in-law regarding certain family discussions, but after reviewing the file this afternoon, I believe there are important facts you may not have been told." I sat upright immediately. "What facts?" There was a long pause before she answered. "First, I need to ask you one question. Do you still have the original will that your husband signed before he passed away?" I looked toward the small leather document case that I always carried in my car. Thomas had insisted years ago that I never leave certain papers inside the house. Suddenly, for the first time that terrible day, I remembered exactly where his original will was waiting. For a long moment I simply stared at the leather document case resting on the passenger seat of my car. Thomas had purchased it almost 20 years earlier, insisting that certain papers should never remain inside the house because documents can protect a family long after memories begin to fade. At the time I had smiled at what sounded like another one of his careful habits. Now those words echoed in my mind with unexpected clarity. I thanked attorney Susan Harper for calling and promised that I would contact her again within the hour. After ending the conversation, I walked out to the parking lot beneath the fading evening sky. The document case was exactly where I had left it. Inside were our marriage certificate, property records, insurance documents, family photographs, and a large sealed envelope marked in Thomas's handwriting. Written across the front were the words, "Original last will and testament. Keep safe." My heartbeat quickened as I carefully removed the envelope. Everything appeared untouched. The attorney's embossed seal remained unbroken, exactly as it had been the day Thomas brought it home after meeting with his lawyer. I immediately returned to my hotel room and called attorney Harper. She answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Sullivan, do you have the original document?" "Yes," I replied. "It has never left my possession." I heard her release a slow breath of relief. "That changes several important things." I sat quietly, waiting for her to continue. "The copies included in your son's file contain references to estate planning, but I could not locate the original will before today's meeting. Without comparing both documents, I cannot determine whether every page matches." Her careful wording immediately caught my attention. "Are you saying something may be different?" Another brief silence followed. "I am saying that I prefer facts over assumptions. I believe we should examine the original document before anyone makes further decisions." We agreed to meet at her office early the following morning. After ending the call, I placed the envelope on the desk and looked at Thomas's familiar handwriting. My husband had never been careless. During 45 years of marriage he planned birthdays months in advance, balanced every household account by hand, and believed every important promise deserved to be written down. If he had protected these papers so carefully, there had to be a reason. Sleep never truly came that night. Every hour I found myself replaying memories of David growing up inside that house. I remembered teaching him to ride his bicycle on the sidewalk, celebrating high school graduation in the backyard, and watching him carry Jennifer across the front porch after their wedding. Never once had I imagined standing outside that same doorway as though I were unwelcome. Early the next morning I arrived at Attorney Harper's office, carrying the sealed envelope myself. She welcomed me warmly into a conference room before carefully examining the attorney's seal. "This has never been opened," she said. She invited another senior attorney to witness the process before breaking the seal according to legal procedure. Page after page appeared exactly as expected until she reached the final section. Her expression changed instantly. She adjusted her glasses and slowly read the last page a second time. Then she looked directly at me with unmistakable surprise. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said softly, "there is an additional provision here that does not appear anywhere in the copies your son submitted. Before anyone changes the ownership, occupancy, or possession of this home, this clause requires one very specific legal step that, according to everything I have reviewed, has never taken place. Attorney Harper carefully turned the final page toward me and pointed to a paragraph that had been attached as an official amendment to Thomas's original will. I recognized his signature immediately, followed by the signatures of 2 witnesses and the notary public who had handled our estate planning years before. She spoke slowly so that every word was perfectly clear. Your husband anticipated that disagreements might arise after his passing. This amendment states that the family home shall remain your exclusive residence for the rest of your natural life unless you personally choose to leave, permanently move to assisted living by your own written consent, or a court of competent jurisdiction determines that you are legally unable to manage your own affairs. I read the paragraph myself, hardly believing what I was seeing. The language was unmistakable. Thomas had not simply left me the house. He had protected my right to live there regardless of future family disagreements. Attorney Harper continued reading. Any attempt to remove the surviving spouse from the residence without satisfying these conditions shall be considered inconsistent with the expressed intent of the testator. She looked up from the document. Mrs. Sullivan, based on everything I have reviewed so far, none of those required conditions have occurred. I slowly asked the question that had been growing inside me since the previous afternoon. Then how were they able to change the locks? She folded her hands thoughtfully. Changing locks does not automatically create legal authority. Sometimes people act first because they believe they are entitled to do so. Sometimes they misunderstand the law. Sometimes they receive incomplete advice. Her careful choice of words told me she was still trying to understand how this situation had developed. She then opened the file that David and Jennifer had submitted earlier in the week. Several photocopies of estate documents lay neatly organized inside. She compared them page by page with the original will. Everything matched until the final amendment. The copy inside their file ended 1 page earlier. The protective clause was completely absent. Attorney Harper frowned. This is highly unusual. I quietly asked, could someone have removed that page? She shook her head before answering. I am not prepared to make that conclusion. There are several possible explanations. What matters now is establishing which version was used during every discussion concerning the property. She excused herself briefly to speak with the senior attorney who had witnessed the opening of the sealed envelope. When both returned several minutes later, the senior attorney carefully examined the original document himself before nodding with confidence. The amendment is authentic, he said. The seals, signatures, paper, and notarization are all consistent with the original execution date. Hearing those words brought me relief for the first time since standing outside my own front door. Thomas had protected me exactly as he always promised he would. Attorney Harper then closed both files and looked directly at me. I believe everyone involved needs to meet as soon as possible. I am requesting that your son and daughter-in-law come here this afternoon so these documents can be reviewed together. I quietly agreed, hoping that once David saw his father's original wishes, everything could still be repaired. As Attorney Harper reached for her telephone to arrange the meeting, her assistant entered the conference room carrying a newly delivered envelope. This was just dropped off by courier, she explained. The envelope was addressed to Attorney Harper in Thomas Sullivan's handwriting and bore a clear instruction across the front that none of us had ever seen before, to be opened only if anyone attempts to remove Margaret from her home. The conference room became completely silent as Attorney Harper examined the courier envelope. Unlike the will, this package had never been in my possession. My name appeared nowhere on the front. Instead, Thomas had addressed it directly to the law firm that prepared our estate plan many years earlier. Beneath the address was a handwritten instruction that read, "Open only if Margaret is ever denied access to her home." Attorney Harper looked toward the senior attorney, who nodded before carefully slicing the seal. Inside rested a single handwritten letter and another notarized document attached behind it. She began reading the letter aloud. If this envelope has been opened, then something has happened that I prayed would never happen. Margaret, if you are hearing these words, please remember that I trusted your judgment more than anyone else's. I know you will always choose kindness before conflict, but kindness must never require surrendering what is rightfully yours. My eyes filled with tears as I listened to Thomas's familiar voice through his carefully chosen words. The letter continued. If any person, including members of our own family, attempts to remove you from our home without your willing consent, I direct my attorneys to enforce every protection contained within our estate plan. This house was built for you as much as for me, and no one has the moral or legal authority to force you from it. Attorney Harper quietly placed the letter beside the will before turning to the attached document. It was titled Protective Occupancy Directive. She explained that Thomas had created it at the same time he signed the amendment to the will. The directive required the estate's attorneys to intervene immediately if anyone attempted to deny me access to the property while I remained the lawful surviving spouse. It also instructed that local law enforcement could be asked to assist in peacefully restoring lawful access if voluntary cooperation failed. I looked at Attorney Harper with disbelief. Thomas thought this far ahead. She smiled gently. Your husband believed careful planning prevented unnecessary conflict. Everything here appears to have been prepared years before his passing. At that moment her telephone rang. She answered briefly before placing the call on speaker. It was David. His voice sounded uncertain. Miss Harper, Jennifer and I received your message. We are on our way. She calmly replied, thank you. Please bring every estate document currently in your possession. We need to compare them with the originals. After ending the call, she turned back toward me. Mrs. Sullivan, I recommend that you remain calm regardless of what happens during today's meeting. We are dealing with documents, not emotions. I nodded because I knew Thomas would have wanted exactly that. Less than 40 minutes later I watched through the conference room window as David and Jennifer entered the building carrying a large binder filled with paperwork. Jennifer appeared confident as she walked toward the reception desk, but that confidence faded the instant she saw the original sealed documents resting on the conference table. David stopped walking altogether. His eye settled on his father's unmistakable handwriting, and the color slowly disappeared from his face. Before either of them spoke a single word, Attorney Harper placed Thomas's final letter in the center of the table and quietly said, there are several original documents that neither of you has ever seen, and before this meeting is over, every one of them will be read exactly as Thomas Sullivan intended. David slowly lowered himself into the chair across from me without saying a word. Jennifer remained standing for several seconds before finally taking the seat beside him, a confident expression replaced by visible uncertainty. Attorney Harper placed Thomas's handwritten letter in front of them but did not immediately begin reading. Instead, she calmly compared the original will, the amendment, the Protective Occupancy Directive, and the photocopies they had provided. After several careful minutes she folded her hands. Mr. Sullivan, she said, looking directly at David, can you explain where these photocopies came from? David swallowed nervously before answering. Jennifer and I found them in a folder inside the filing cabinet after my father passed away. We believed they were complete. Attorney Harper nodded. Did either of you ever request the original documents from this office? David quietly admitted that they had not. Jennifer spoke next. We assumed the copies were enough. We only wanted to organize everything before Margaret became overwhelmed. Attorney Harper remained professional. Intentions aside, the documents you relied upon were incomplete. The original estate file contains additional legally executed provisions that significantly affect the occupancy of this property. She carefully turned the final amendment toward them. David leaned forward and began reading. His eyes widened as he reached the paragraph guaranteeing my right to remain in the home for the rest of my life. He looked up in disbelief. I have never seen this page before. Jennifer immediately reached for the document herself. The room became silent except for the sound of paper turning. As she finished reading, the confidence that had carried her into the office disappeared completely. Attorney Harper then unfolded Thomas's final handwritten letter and slowly read every sentence aloud. No one interrupted. Every word reflected the man I had shared my life with, calm, thoughtful, and determined to protect his family without creating unnecessary conflict. When she reached the sentence declaring that no family member possessed either the moral or legal authority to force me from my home, David lowered his head into his hands. Several moments passed before he finally spoke. "Mom, I believed we were helping you. Jennifer kept saying we needed to prepare before something happened unexpectedly. I thought we were preventing future problems." His voice carried genuine regret, but the pain of the previous day still weighed heavily inside me. I answered quietly. "Helping someone never begins by changing the locks while they are away." Jennifer looked toward me for the first time since entering the room. "Margaret, I truly believed moving quickly would avoid family conflict. I never intended to hurt you." Before I could respond, Attorney Harper gently interrupted. "Whether anyone intended harm is not the first issue before us. The immediate concern is restoring the legal situation to what it should have been." She then reached for the telephone. "Because access to the lawful resident has been denied, the Protective Occupancy Directive authorizes specific legal steps to restore peaceful possession if voluntary cooperation is not immediate." David looked up with alarm. "What does that mean?" Attorney Harper answered evenly. "It means I am asking both of you to return every key, remove every lock that was installed without Mrs. Sullivan's consent, and accompany us back to the property today. If that cannot be accomplished peacefully, the directive authorizes me to request assistance from local law enforcement while the original estate documents are presented to ensure that your father's final wishes are fully respected." No one objected to Attorney Harper's instructions. David quietly removed a ring of house keys from his pocket and placed them on the conference table. Jennifer followed a moment later, adding another set beside his. Neither of them attempted to defend what had happened. The weight of Thomas's original documents had changed the atmosphere completely. Attorney Harper collected the keys, placed the original will, the Protective Occupancy Directive, and Thomas's handwritten letter into a secure leather portfolio, then invited everyone to travel together to my home. The drive across Columbus felt strangely quiet. I followed behind Attorney Harper's vehicle while David and Jennifer drove separately. Every familiar street reminded me how many ordinary days had begun and ended in the brick house that Thomas and I had shared for decades. When we turned onto my street, several neighbors glanced toward the small procession of cars but quickly returned to their own yards. Attorney Harper parked first and walked to the front porch carrying the leather portfolio. She examined the newly installed lock before turning toward David. "Please unlock the front door." David hesitated for only a second before inserting his key. The lock clicked open. He slowly stepped aside and looked at me. "Mom, you should go in first." I remained still for a moment, taking a deep breath before crossing the threshold. The familiar scent of polished wood and old books greeted me immediately. For the first time since the previous afternoon, I was standing inside my own home again. Nothing appeared damaged, but subtle changes caught my attention almost immediately. Several framed family photographs had been moved from the fireplace mantel. My favorite reading chair had been relocated closer to the window. A cardboard box labeled storage rested beside the staircase. I quietly walked through each room while the others remained respectfully behind me. When I entered the bedroom that Thomas and I had shared for so many years, I noticed empty spaces on the dresser where personal keepsakes had always remained. The wooden jewelry box was still missing. So was Thomas's pocket watch that he received from his father. I turned back toward David. "Where are these things?" He looked genuinely surprised. Jennifer told me they had already been packed safely. Jennifer immediately answered. "I placed them in the guest room closet because I thought we would reorganize everything after Margaret settled somewhere else." Her words faded as she realized what she had admitted. Attorney Harper calmly wrote several notes before speaking. "Nothing inside this residence should have been reorganized without Mrs. Sullivan's permission." Jennifer quietly nodded without arguing. Together we opened the guest room closet. Inside were several carefully sealed boxes containing family photographs, personal letters, keepsakes, and Thomas's belongings. Relief washed over me as I gently lifted the small wooden jewelry box from the top shelf. Inside rested my wedding ring set, the anniversary necklace Thomas had given me on our 40th anniversary, and a folded handwritten note I had never noticed before. It was tucked beneath the velvet lining as though someone had intentionally hidden it years earlier. I unfolded the yellowed paper and immediately recognized Thomas's handwriting once again. The note contained only a few sentences, but before I could finish reading, Attorney Harper looked toward the front window. A marked police vehicle had just pulled quietly to the curb. One uniformed officer stepped onto the sidewalk carrying an official folder in his hand and politely knocked on my front door, explaining that he had been dispatched to verify lawful occupancy after receiving legal documentation from Attorney Harper's office. The police officer introduced himself with quiet professionalism and removed his hat before stepping inside the foyer. Attorney Harper greeted him and presented the original will, the Protective Occupancy Directive, and the supporting legal documents. The officer examined each page carefully without rushing. He asked only a few factual questions. "Mrs. Sullivan, are you the surviving spouse named in these documents?" I answered that I was. He then turned toward David and Jennifer. "Did either of you replace the locks on this residence without Mrs. Sullivan's written consent?" David lowered his eyes and answered honestly. "Yes, officer. We did." Jennifer nodded silently beside him. The officer remained calm and respectful. "Thank you for your honesty. Based on the documentation provided and the statements made here today, Mrs. Sullivan is entitled to peaceful access to this residence. I am here only to ensure that everyone understands the current legal situation and that today's resolution remains peaceful." Hearing those words lifted a weight from my shoulders that I had carried since standing helplessly on my own porch the previous afternoon. No raised voices were necessary. No argument followed. The law simply confirmed what Thomas had worked so carefully to protect. Attorney Harper thanked the officer, who remained available while we completed the remaining discussions. I unfolded the small handwritten note I had discovered beneath the velvet lining of my jewelry box. The paper had yellowed with age, but Thomas's handwriting remained as clear as ever. "Margaret, if you ever find this message, it means life has taken an unexpected turn. Remember that this home was never built from brick alone. It was built from every birthday, every Christmas morning, every difficult season we survived together, and every promise we made. Never allow guilt to convince you that protecting your dignity is the same as hurting your family." I quietly folded the note and held it against my heart for several seconds. David watched me with tears beginning to form in his eyes. "Mom," he said softly, "I never knew Dad wrote any of this. I believed I was preparing for the future, but I stopped listening to you. I should have spoken with you instead of making decisions for you." His apology sounded sincere, and for the first time since all of this began, I recognized the frightened little boy I had once comforted after scraped knees and broken dreams. I walked toward him slowly. "David, mistakes can be repaired, but trust always takes longer." He nodded without trying to defend himself. Jennifer stepped forward next. "Margaret, I allowed myself to believe that efficiency mattered more than conversation. I thought I was solving problems before they happened. Instead, I created one that never should have existed." Attorney Harper quietly observed the exchange before closing the leather portfolio containing Thomas's estate documents. "The legal issues appear capable of being resolved through cooperation," she said. "However, I strongly recommend that updated estate planning and clear family communication take place after today's events." Everyone agreed. As the police officer prepared to leave, he handed Attorney Harper a brief incident reference confirming that lawful occupancy had been verified without dispute. Just as the front door closed behind him, Attorney Harper noticed one final sealed envelope tucked inside Thomas's original document case. None of us had seen it before. Across the front, in the same familiar handwriting, were the words, "Open only after Margaret has safely returned home, because this contains the last gift I ever intended to give my family." Attorney Harper carefully lifted the final envelope from Thomas's document case and examined the unbroken seal before looking at each of us. "The instruction is clear," she said quietly. "Margaret has safely returned home. We may now open it." She broke the seal with deliberate care and removed several neatly folded pages along with a small envelope addressed only to David. She began reading the first letter aloud. If you are hearing these words, then the greatest gift I can leave behind is no longer this house. It is the opportunity for my family to remember that love survives only when truth and respect remain together. The room fell completely silent. Thomas continued by explaining that every legal protection had never been created because he expected betrayal. He had created them because he understood that grief often caused good people to make fearful decisions. He wanted every disagreement to be resolved through honesty instead of assumptions. Attorney Harper then opened the smaller envelope addressed to David and handed it directly to him. My son unfolded the letter with shaking hands. He read the first line silently before his voice broke. David, I know you love your mother. If you are reading this, then somewhere along the way fear became louder than trust. Do not measure your success by how efficiently you manage my estate. Measure it by how faithfully you care for the woman who spent her life caring for you. David stopped reading and covered his eyes. After several moments he gathered himself and continued. Thomas reminded him that the house represented memories rather than wealth. He wrote that one day the property would naturally pass according to the estate plan, but only after I had lived there peacefully for as long as I desired. Until that day, my home was never to become a subject of pressure, negotiation, or convenience. Jennifer quietly wiped away tears as David finished the final paragraph. She stepped toward me with genuine humility. Margaret, I cannot change what I did, but I can admit that I was wrong. I allowed planning to replace compassion. I forgot that this was your home before it was ever part of my future. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Forgiveness begins when people choose truth instead of excuses. She nodded gratefully. Attorney Harper then reviewed the practical steps that would follow. The unauthorized locks would remain removed. Every personal belonging would be returned to its original place. Updated copies of the estate documents would be provided to everyone so that no confusion could ever arise again. She also recommended a family meeting every year to review important legal matters together instead of relying upon incomplete information. Everyone agreed immediately. Later that afternoon David and I worked side by side returning photographs to the mantel, placing Thomas's pocket watch back inside the bedroom drawer, and arranging the living room exactly as it had always been. The simple routine reminded me of quieter years when our family solved problems together instead of separately. As the sun settled beyond the maple trees outside the front window, the familiar warmth of home slowly returned. Before leaving, Attorney Harper handed me one final document that had been attached behind Thomas's closing letter. I nearly overlooked this, she admitted. It was a certified statement from Thomas instructing that, exactly 1 year after this matter was peacefully resolved, another sealed letter stored in the law firm's vault should be delivered to the entire family together because, according to his final handwritten note, its contents would reveal one last surprise that none of us had ever imagined. The following weeks unfolded more peacefully than I ever expected. David visited every Saturday morning, not because anyone asked him to, but because he wanted to earn back the trust that had been broken. Together we repaired small things around the house that Thomas had always intended to finish one day. Jennifer came as well, although she always knocked before entering, waiting patiently until I invited her inside. That simple gesture, more than any apology, reminded me that respect had finally returned to our family. Attorney Harper completed the legal updates exactly as promised. Every original document was securely archived, certified copies were distributed to each family member, and written instructions explained. Every provision in plain language so that no misunderstanding could ever happen again. Nearly a year passed before I realized how much had changed. The house no longer felt like a place surrounded by conflict. It had become a place where healing quietly took root. On the anniversary of my return home, Attorney Harper telephoned early that morning. Mrs. Sullivan, she said warmly, today is the date your husband specified. The final sealed letter has been retrieved from our secure vault. Would this afternoon be convenient? By 3 o'clock everyone had gathered once again in my living room. This time there were no legal disputes waiting on the table, only quiet anticipation. Attorney Harper placed the final envelope beside Thomas's framed photograph before carefully opening it. Inside rested a handwritten letter, several family photographs none of us had ever seen, and a small envelope containing a brass key with a faded paper tag attached. She began reading. "If you have reached this day together, then you have already received the greatest inheritance I hope to leave behind. Not money, not property, and not possessions, but the opportunity to choose one another again after disappointment." I felt David quietly reach for Jennifer's hand as Thomas's words filled the room. The letter continued by explaining that forgiveness was never automatic. It was a decision that required courage from every person involved. He wrote that a family willing to admit mistakes could become stronger than one that simply pretended mistakes never happened. Attorney Harper then unfolded one final page. Thomas revealed that years earlier he had rented a small safety deposit box at the local bank under the family trust. The brass key resting on the table belonged to that box. According to his instructions, all of us were to visit the bank together after reading the letter. None of us knew what remained inside. Early the next morning we arrived together at the bank. A representative escorted us into a private viewing room where the safety deposit box was carefully unlocked. Inside rested a leather-bound family journal, several neatly organized photo albums, and a sealed package wrapped in brown paper. Attached to the package was another handwritten note from Thomas. "Please read the journal first." We opened the journal and discovered that Thomas had spent nearly 20 years writing letters for future family milestones, birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, and even difficult seasons he believed might one day come. Each entry reflected hope, wisdom, and encouragement rather than instructions. As I gently turned another page, a folded document slipped onto the table. Attorney Harper picked it up, glanced at the heading, and looked at all of us with quiet surprise before saying, "I believe your husband has just revealed one final decision that changes the future of this family in a way none of us expected." Attorney Harper carefully unfolded the document that had slipped from Thomas's journal and smiled before handing it to me. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said softly, "this is not another legal restriction. It is your husband's final family plan." I looked down and immediately recognized Thomas's signature at the bottom of the page. The document explained that several years before his passing he had quietly established the Sullivan Family Legacy Fund using a portion of his personal investments. The purpose was not to make anyone wealthy. Instead, the fund was created to help future generations of our family pursue education, overcome unexpected hardships, and support meaningful community service. Thomas had written that no one could receive assistance simply because they were related by blood. Every request would require the unanimous approval of a small family committee consisting of me, David, and one independent trustee appointed by Attorney Harper's firm. His final instruction explained why. Money without character divides families. Shared responsibility builds them. We all remained silent as those words settled into our hearts. Attorney Harper continued reading. Thomas had anticipated that one day I might feel lonely living in the house by myself. Rather than encouraging me to leave, he asked David and Jennifer to make the house the center of future family gatherings whenever I wished. Birthdays, holidays, Sunday dinners, and celebrations were to remain there as long as I called it home. He believed that children should always know where the family's story began. David looked around the familiar living room with tears in his eyes. "Dad never stopped teaching us," he whispered. Jennifer nodded quietly. "He even found a way to guide us after he was gone." I closed the journal gently and looked at both of them. "Your father protected this house because he hoped it would protect this family." For a long moment none of us spoke. Finally David stood, walked across the room, and embraced me. This time there was no hesitation, no misunderstanding, and no fear between us. "Mom," he said, "I cannot erase what happened, but I promise that every decision from now on will begin with a conversation, never an assumption." Jennifer stepped beside us. "And I promise that I will always remember this is your home, not just a future inheritance." I smiled through quiet tears and reached for both of their hands. "Then your father has already received the answer he hoped for." During the months that followed, our family slowly built new traditions. Sunday dinners returned. The family photographs were placed back on the mantel. Thomas's journal became part of every holiday gathering as we read one of his letters together before sharing a meal. The Sullivan Family Legacy Fund later helped one young relative attend college and quietly assisted another family member through a difficult season without creating embarrassment or conflict. The house remained exactly where it had always stood, but its greatest value no longer rested in its walls. It lived in the promises renewed inside them. Sometimes I still sat alone in my favorite chair during the quiet evenings, looking at Thomas's photograph above the fireplace. I would smile because I finally understood what he had planned all along. The police had restored my right to enter my home, but Thomas's wisdom had restored something far more valuable. He had not merely protected a house. He had saved a family from losing itself, proving that the strongest inheritance any person can leave behind is not property preserved by locks or legal documents, but love protected by truth, respect, forgiveness, and the courage to choose one another again. Several years passed more quietly than any of us could have imagined. The frightening afternoon when I stood locked outside my own front door slowly became a painful memory instead of an open wound. Every spring the maple tree Thomas had planted in the front yard spread a little farther across the lawn, reminding me that the strongest things in life grew slowly when they were cared for with patience. David never missed our Sunday dinners. Jennifer became the first person to arrive each week, often carrying fresh flowers for the dining room table and asking whether I needed anything repaired before our family meal began. Those simple acts never erased the past, but they proved that sincere change is measured through consistent actions rather than beautiful promises. The Sullivan Family Legacy Fund also became exactly what Thomas had hoped it would become. Instead of creating arguments over money, it inspired conversations about responsibility, generosity, and service. Every request was discussed carefully by the three of us, just as Thomas had instructed. Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes it was no. Every decision required honesty, compassion, and agreement. Because of that process, our family learned to solve difficult questions together instead of allowing misunderstandings to quietly grow. Thomas's leather journal gradually became our most treasured family tradition. Each Thanksgiving, Christmas, and anniversary we opened another letter that he had written years earlier. Somehow his words always seemed perfectly timed, as though he had somehow anticipated exactly what we would need to hear. One evening after reading another entry together, David quietly looked toward me and smiled. "Mom, I used to believe Dad was preparing documents. Now I understand he was preparing people." I smiled back because I knew exactly what he meant. Thomas had never tried to control the future. He had simply given us the wisdom to face it together. As I grew older, friends occasionally asked whether I planned to sell the house or move into a retirement community. I always answered the same way. One day. Perhaps, but only when the decision belongs to me. Those words always reminded David and Jennifer of the lesson that had changed our family forever. My independence was never something to be managed. It was something to be respected. One peaceful autumn afternoon I sat on the front porch watching neighborhood children ride their bicycles along the sidewalk while golden leaves drifted across the yard. David arrived with Jennifer carrying homemade apple pie, just as they often did. Before going inside, the three of us paused beneath the old maple tree. David quietly placed his hand on my shoulder. "Mom," he said, "thank you for giving us the chance to become the family Dad believed we could be." I looked at both of them with gratitude. Your father opened the door. All of us chose to walk through it. Together we stepped inside the home that had witnessed every chapter of our lives. The photograph still rested on the mantel. Thomas's pocket watch remained safely in its drawer. The journal waited on the bookshelf for the next family gathering. Nothing about the house seemed extraordinary to someone passing by on the street, yet inside those familiar walls lived a story that every generation of our family would one day remember. It was never truly about changing locks, legal papers, or an inheritance. It was about a husband whose wisdom reached beyond his lifetime, a mother who refused to surrender her dignity, a son willing to admit his mistakes, and a family that discovered the greatest legacy is never the home that parents leave behind, but the love, trust, and respect they teach their children to protect long after they are gone. Many more seasons came and went, and with each passing year I understood a little more clearly that a family's greatest victories are usually quiet ones. They happen around kitchen tables, on front porches, during ordinary conversations, and inside homes where people choose patience over pride. I remained in the house Thomas and I had built together, not because I feared change, but because every room reminded me that a life well lived leaves traces far more meaningful than furniture or photographs. The neighborhood changed as younger families moved in, children grew taller, and familiar faces gradually became lifelong friends. More than once, neighbors asked why our family always gathered at my home instead of taking turns at different houses. David would smile before I could answer. Because this is where our family learned what home really means. Jennifer often added that the dining room table had become the most important place in our lives because difficult conversations were no longer avoided there. They were welcomed. Every birthday, every Thanksgiving, and every Christmas included one tradition that no one ever suggested changing. Before the meal began, someone would open Thomas's journal and read one letter aloud. Sometimes the message spoke about gratitude. Sometimes it encouraged forgiveness. Other times it simply reminded us to appreciate ordinary days before they quietly became precious memories. Even the youngest members of our growing family learned to listen carefully because they knew each letter carried wisdom that somehow remained timeless. The Sullivan Family Legacy Fund continued serving exactly the purpose Thomas had imagined. It quietly helped family members pursue college degrees, recover from unexpected hardships, and support charitable work throughout our community. The process never became easier simply because we loved one another. We still discussed every request thoughtfully, weighing responsibility with compassion, just as Thomas had instructed. Looking back, I realized that the greatest success of the fund had very little to do with financial assistance. It had taught us how to make important decisions together without allowing fear or misunderstanding to divide us. One peaceful afternoon, years after everything had happened, David and I sat beneath the old maple tree watching our grandchildren play in the yard. He looked toward the front porch where I had once stood unable to enter my own home and quietly shook his head. "I still think about that day," he admitted. "It reminds me how close I came to losing something far more valuable than a house." I gently placed my hand over his. "The important part is not that we almost lost each other," I replied. "The important part is that we chose to find our way back." He smiled with quiet gratitude. As the evening sunlight settled across the lawn, I looked toward the familiar windows of the house that had witnessed love, grief, misunderstanding, forgiveness, and healing. I realized that Thomas's greatest gift had never been hidden inside envelopes, legal documents, journals, or carefully written instructions. Those things had only pointed us toward a much simpler truth. Families are not protected by locks, deeds, or inheritances alone. They are protected every single day by honest conversations, humble hearts, mutual respect, and the willingness to place relationships above pride. Whenever people ask me what happened after I was locked out of my own home, I simply smile and tell them that I eventually walked back through the front door. What I do not always tell them is that the far greater miracle happened afterward, because while I regained my house that day, our entire family found its way home together.